must keep watching the skies. I have to keep watching the sky. Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to my weekend reading report. It's time for my weekend reading report, where I'll talk about all of the exciting things that I've read during the past week. And this week, I've been pretty busy, but I have been able to read a couple of things, so let's talk about the stuff that I've read during this past week. So the first thing I finished, I only finished one book this week. I've been busy watching the skies. But I did finish one book this week, and that was this. This is The Shadow. This is The Shadow, Volume 2 from Pyramid Books, Volume 2 from Pyramid Books. This is The Black Master. So, even though it's Volume 2 in the Pyramid series, it wasn't actually the second Shadow story that came out in the pulps years ago. I think it was the 8th or 9th Shadow story. I can't remember. But there were a few in between. You know, these old paperback reprints, they weren't done in any kind of order. Fortunately, they did have The Living Shadow come out first. That only makes sense. But all the rest of them didn't really come out in order, from what I remember. But The Black Master. So this is a pretty good Shadow novel, even though it's not the best. It's kind of, the first half of it is kind of meandering. And it has to do with the mystery surrounding some bombings. There have been some bombings in New York. And the authorities believe that the bombings are the result of terrorists. They're terrorist bombings. But the Shadow, the mysterious Shadow, has other ideas. He sees another kind of horrific plan behind these bombings in New York. And the second half of this is really good. So the first half is kind of like, it takes a while to get where it's going. The evil Black Master, the Black Master, a criminal mastermind. There are no shortages of criminal masterminds back in old pulp fiction. And yes, there was a criminal mastermind in this one. And a good one. He nearly takes out the Shadow, which is kind of impressive. So, you know, the Shadow, he had a tough time in this adventure. Unfortunately, the Black Master, his identity, I think, is supposed to be a mystery, even though as soon as this one character shows up pretty early in the novel, immediately you're like, oh, this guy's the Black Master. Obviously. I mean, he obviously is the Black Master. It can be nobody else except him. And indeed, it was him. So if you read this, you know, by the time you get to chapter 2 or something, whenever this character shows up, you're like, oh yeah, that's the Black Master. Totally. And it is. So there's no real mystery in this, but still, a good pulp adventure. And I enjoyed it. And in my 500 book challenge, is this number 80? I can't remember. I think this was actually number 80. So, yeah. So now I'm reading book number 81. And that is this book, Between Time and Terror, which has a bunch of science fiction horror stories in it. And I'm only 4 stories in. And they were a great first 4 stories. The first story, it opens with The Color Out of Space by H.P. Lovecraft, which of course is a masterpiece. It literally is, I think, a masterpiece of science fiction horror. And the perfect story to open up this volume. The Color Out of Space is a really interesting story. I mean, I've read it who knows how many times, and of course it opened this volume, so I read it again. And it's effective every time. I think it's a genuinely frightening story. It's really actually pretty scary. And the scary part of it is that the horror, it's an extraterrestrial horror. An interesting one, in that it comes down out of the sky in a meteor and lands in this unfortunate family's farm. and causes all kinds of horrific trouble. And, you know, Lovecraft was really good at this in that it shows you man's place in the universe in a way, in that we are small and insignificant, and how when something bad happens, very often it's just because, you know, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the main character in this story, or the farmer in this story, he's wondering, you know, what did I do to deserve this? I've always tried to be a good person, but this seems like a judgment, you know. And of course, the horrific part is that it's not, you know. No matter how good you are, how good a person you are, the universe doesn't care. The universe is impersonal. It doesn't care whether you're good or bad. It doesn't care who you are. And that's a scary thing. And it's an unfortunate fact of life. You know, very often when something really bad happens to people, if somebody becomes very ill with a deadly disease, or if somebody's killed by getting hit by a car, or there's some other terrible accident, it's natural for a human being to ask, you know, why did this happen? And we're thinking of these things in human terms, you know. And so we're thinking, you know, what did this person do to deserve this? And of course the answer is nothing. This person did nothing to deserve this. It's just, you know, stuff happens, whether you're good or bad, you know. The reason this person got hit by this car is because they, you know, stepped off the curb too quickly and that car was driving too fast. That's it. That's the answer. And the same thing goes with diseases and things like that. People don't do anything to deserve these things. These things can happen to anybody. And that is terrifying. And that is brought out pretty clearly in The Color Out of Space. There's a bunch of other really creepy, scary stuff in this story, but I think that is this really scary part of the story. Now, the second story in this is by pulp writer Frank Belknap Long. It's called The Man with 1,000 Legs, and it's disturbing. Belknap Long was a friend of H.P. Lovecraft. Unfortunately, he didn't have Lovecraft's talent, really, when it comes to telling scary stories. However, he did have really creepy ideas, and there's some really creepy stuff lurking in Long's stories. And this is one of those stories where the idea is a simple one. I mean, this could have been a story that you would find in an old EC science fiction comic book, you know, an old horror comic from the 50s. But it's a simple idea. It's basically a mad scientist story where a mad scientist becomes a monster. But the monster is really disturbing. And there are just some creepy things about this story. I think sometimes Long's ideas were better than the execution or the writing of the story itself. His stories sometimes have really great creepy ideas, and yet in the writing kind of fails the story in a way. This one I think works pretty well. Not nearly as good as Color Out of Space or the story that comes after it, but it's good. I'm glad it's in there because it was a good story to read. It belongs in the volume. Next one I read was The Vaults of Yo Vombis, which is a Clark Ashton Smith story, which is fantastic. You'll find that story reprinted a lot in anthologies that have Clark Ashton Smith stories in it. It's just because it's terrifying. It's an absolutely terrifying story, which takes place on Mars in an archaeological expedition to a long dead city on Mars. But they find something there, and it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. Great, great story. And of course, the fourth story that I read in this volume is Who Goes There? Who Goes There, which became The Thing. It's by John W. Campbell Jr. And Who Goes There became The Thing from Another World in the 50s, and then later on became The Thing in the 80s. Great story, really great story about an Arctic expedition or base up there, and they encounter an extraterrestrial, and if you've seen the movie The Thing, you know exactly what they found, because The second version of The Thing, the 1980s version of The Thing, aside from just being a masterpiece in itself, that's a fantastic movie. One of the greatest horror movies ever made. And it actually follows the points of this story fairly well. I mean, even the characters' names are the same. It certainly is more faithful to the story than the original version of The Thing was, as much as I like that movie. Excellent story. And you owe it to yourself to read it. It's, easy to find who goes there. If you have a Kindle, you can get it in a second. And you'll find it lurking in many of these old anthologies. So that's as far as I've gotten in this anthology so far. Between Time and Terror, which is edited by a few people. Robert Weinberg, Stefan Osman... Okay, how do I pronounce your name? Osmandowitz. Sorry, Stefan Osmandowitz. I'm mispronouncing your name. And Martin H. Greenberg, who has done like a million anthologies. But this one is really good. And it's perfect to read out here, when you're out up here watching the skies. So that was cool. And of course, I've also been reading Thor. I'm a little bit behind on Thor, and so I'm hoping to catch up. Well, today, I guess this is going up on Sunday. So I'm hoping to knock out this epic collection just in one go and sort of catch up where I need to be. I'm reading the entire original run of Thor, which ended in the 1990s. And I need to have it all read by October 5th of 2024. And I'm doing pretty well, but I'm a little bit behind at this point just because I've been so busy watching the skies for Alien Invasion. Someone's got to do it. But this is so good. It's so good. We've just had the Titanic Troll War. The Troll War just happened. Asgard, of course, defeated the trolls, but it's full of this Jack Kirby amazement. I mean, it's just, at this point in Thor, there's just so many awesome things happening in this comic book. It's just fantastic. So this is volume 3 of the Epic Collections, which has stories from 1966 to 68. So I'm still in the 1960s with Thor, but it's so great. Jack Kirby, man, he's the best. I did get a couple things in the mail, and they're kind of cool things. I got the latest issue from Gary Lovisi's Paperback Parade. Now, Gary Lovisi doesn't just publish this magazine. He also writes a bunch of books. He's written a lot of books. And he has his own YouTube channel, BookTube channel, where he always breaks out the coolest old stuff. If you're into cool old paperbacks and stuff, man, you got to check out his channel. I'll link it down below. But the Paperback Parade is just a cool magazine that he publishes all about, weird old paperbacks. And not only are the articles interesting, and they always are, they're just full of these great old paperback covers. And yeah, it's a great magazine. I really enjoy it, and has some. I'm reading the Shadow paperbacks now, off and on, and this has some variant covers. I don't think I have any of the variant covers. Do I? I don't think I do. They're kind of rare, I think, and so he has some of those there listed. If you're interested in this, you can go to his website, which I'll put up here in the skies. The skies, which I keep watching. I keep watching the skies. I will put his website right there if you're interested in picking up some of these or some back issues of Paperback Parade. It's a great magazine. So Gary Lovisi, thank you for sending this to me. That's awesome. He often sends me cool stuff because he's that kind of guy. Now, I also got something really awesome in the mail. It is, of course, a comic book. I'm still on the 500 book challenge. So I can't buy regular books, but comic books don't count. Unfortunately, they also don't count when you read them. But I got this. This is Atlas Comics Library #1, Adventures into Terror. Now, Atlas Comics became Marvel Comics. But back in the 50s, they published a bunch of horror stuff and all kinds of other weird stuff. And a lot of it was so cool. They did reprint some of these in Masterworks editions a few years ago, but now they're being reprinted, and Marvel has licensed it out, actually. Is this... Let me make sure I get the publisher correct. Fantagraphic Books. Fantagraphic Books does this. Fantagraphics Books. So Marvel didn't print it themselves. They licensed it out to Sorry. I can barely speak. It's because it's so cold out here. Fantagraphics Books. And they did a wonderful job with this first volume. Has the first 8 issues, I think, of Adventures into Terror, their 1950s horror title. No, these are not as good as the EC comics, but they're pretty darn cool. And we've got this great introduction by Dr. Michael J. Vasallo, who knows all about Atlas Comics. He is the guy you go to when you want to know about Atlas Comics. But it reproduces the covers, but it also reproduces the advertisements, and the stories themselves just look beautiful. They're reprinted on this matte paper, which I like better than the glossy paper for these reprints of these old stories. They just look really, really great. And so I was pretty excited to get this. There are several more. The Living Dead. There are several more of these coming out, and I'm going to get all of them. This is really, really cool. So I got that. As for what I'm going to read next, that's a good question. What I read next kind of depends on where I am. Am I still going to be up here watching the skies when I'm done with Between Time and Terror? I think I've still got almost 300 pages of this left. So I probably will not finish this by, tomorrow tomorrow. Because day after tomorrow I'm going back home. I can only watch the skies so long, and then I have to go back to my regular business. But I've got 300 pages of this left. If I do somehow finish 300 pages between now and then, I will begin something else. Otherwise, I will probably... I really should get to Roger's Cheapo Book Club. And so I really should read When the Sleeper Wakes. Or The Sleeper Awakes. One of those by H.G. Wells. So that'll probably be the next thing I read. But who knows? I'll let you know next week. Until then, keep watching the skies. Keep watching the skies!